Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise of global research and give you the knowledge you really need. Today, we're getting into infrastructure. And look, we're not just talking about, filling potholes here. We mean the huge fundamental shifts happening right now, globally, in planning, in investment, technology. It's disruptive. The whole roads and bridges idea, it just doesn't cover it anymore.
No, it really doesn't. The definition itself has changed so much. We're talking about modern physical assets, things absolutely essential for a country to function, and critically, they have to contribute to a sustainable future. So our mission for you today is really unpacking these paradoxes in global infrastructure investment. We want to identify those new finance models that are speeding up the clean energy transition and show you how these powerful digital tools are forcing a complete rethink of urban and energy planning all over the world.
And when you talk about shifts, well, you have to talk about the money, or maybe the lack of it in certain places. That global infrastructure investment gap. It's massive, we know that. And closing it means long-term, stable partnerships. You need policymakers, regulators, big institutional investors, all working together.
The sheer scale of the need is, it's staggering.
Right.
And that creates this central conflict we keep seeing in the sources.
Right. It leads to this Catch-22 situation, doesn't it? You see it everywhere. The places that most desperately need the capital, where the investment gaps are just huge, they're almost always the ones that find it hardest to attract the private finance needed to actually close that gap.
It's a classic risk-reward mismatch. I mean, the high-need areas often look like higher risk, right? So private capital tends to flow toward safer, more established markets. What we need to dig into is how global bodies are trying to break that cycle, using innovative finance, new tech, trying to get the money flowing where it's needed most.
Okay, so when we look at infrastructure now as an asset class, is it just one big bucket? Or are investors making distinctions?
Oh, there's a huge distinction. Definitely a split between what you might call old and newer types. Old infrastructure. Your traditional roads, water, sanitation, it's still absolutely vital. Can't forget that. I mean, 3.6 billion people globally still lack safe sanitation.
Right.
That basic need isn't going anywhere.
But the real buzz, the financial excitement, that's probably around the newer stuff.
Exactly. Renewables, and especially digital infrastructure. That's where the private money is really flowing. Digital is just soaring, everything from fiber networks to data centers. It's fascinating, actually. One major investment firm said digital assets are now over 20% of their total infrastructure investments. That's a huge shift in their portfolio.
20%, that's really significant. But doesn't that rapid investment, especially in things like 5G in richer countries, have a downside for the developing world?
It does, unfortunately. As advanced economies race ahead with the cutting edge, that digital divide is just set to get wider. You risk creating this two-speed world where connectivity basically dictates your economic future.
And speaking of the global picture, that takes us straight into geopolitics, doesn't it? These big infrastructure pushes. You can't really talk global investment without mentioning the major initiatives building these huge corridors.
Yeah, the most obvious example for years has been China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. Estimates are around, $1 trillion over the last decade or so. And initially, yes, it was very traditional. Ports, roads, rail, but it's broadened out fast.
So it's not just about physical stuff anymore, moving goods.
Not at all. What's really interesting is the push into digital development. Building 5G base stations, laying digital corridors across partner countries. They're directly competing in that new infrastructure space we were just talking about.
Right, and that kind of strategic investment, well, it naturally prompts a response. So now we see the West, through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, backing the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC.
IMEC is, wow. It's a colossal project. Just the complexity, the ambition of linking India to Europe through the Middle East. Some people are calling it the most ambitious project of our generation. These things just highlight how tightly geopolitics and infrastructure money are woven together now.
Okay, but let's bring it back to that Catch-22, those regions that need the most help. If we look at emerging markets, say, in Africa, just how big is that funding gap you mentioned earlier?
The estimates for Africa's annual infrastructure funding gap, they range between about 68 billion and 108 billion US dollars. That's every year. Capital is needed just to keep up with demand and basic development.
That is just a staggering shortfall. And yeah, many of these are frontier markets. They don't have deep local capital markets, so they have to rely heavily on public-private partnerships, PPPs, and multilateral institutions like the World Bank.
And this is exactly where that financial engineering becomes critical. The urgent need is for sophisticated risk mitigation. Investors need some assurance, whether they're public or private, so we have to create these PPPs, these financial instruments, specifically designed to partially de-risk the opportunities. That's what makes a project bankable in a high-need area.
And the cost of not de-risking becomes really clear in the most extreme cases, right?
Exactly. Think about Ukraine reconstruction, just monumental. Their national recovery plan needs. Estimates are over $750 billion. Without strong, de-risked ways to invest, private capital just won't flow. It'll wait on the sidelines for the risks to go down, and we simply can't afford to wait.
Okay, so that need for innovative finance leads us straight into the next massive challenge, decarbonization. If we just look at the US, for example, the goal is 100% non-emitting energy. But back in 2019, 80% of US energy still came from fossil fuels. We're talking about flipping the entire grid on its head.
And the speed needed is, well, it's daunting. Right now, non-hydro renewables, wind and solar, mostly they're about 12% of the electricity market share. To hit those climate targets, that share needs to jump to roughly 75% in the next 15 years.
Wait, hang on. From 12% to 75%? In 15 years. That's exponential.
It means we need a sustained growth rate more than 6 times faster than what we managed over the last 15 years. This isn't just gradual change. It demands a radical shift in how we finance and build clean power.
Okay, so how do we possibly do that? One idea popping up in the sources is these public finance institutions, like the proposed Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator, the National Climate Bank idea. What's the core idea there?
Well, its functions about efficiency, but also, importantly, equity. The goal is really twofold. First, maximize the greenhouse gas cuts you get for every public dollar spent, make taxpayer money work harder, leverage it. And second, aggressively push down energy costs for consumers, make the transition affordable for ordinary people.
Right, so these public banks are meant to tackle specific problems that private banks maybe can't or won't touch. What are the two biggest financial hurdles stopping renewables from just taking over everywhere?
Okay, the first one is what the sources call marginal project economics. Put simply, if a new solar or wind project costs even a tiny bit more than the existing power from the grid, it just won't get built. But if public financing steps in, maybe absorbs some risk, offers lower interest rates, it can lower that upfront cost. Suddenly, that renewable power is competitive, maybe even cheaper. It pulls projects from being marginal into being viable, expands the whole market.
That makes total sense. Lowering capital cost is key. What's the second barrier? The one hitting households?
That's perceived credit risk, especially for low-income households or communities. Private lenders, they lean heavily on traditional things like FICO scores. The problem? Many perfectly creditworthy low-income families just fail those standard checks, even if they have a spotless record, years and years, of paying their utility bills on time.
So the system they use isn't actually measuring the right thing for energy-related payments. They're being penalized.
Exactly. And that is a perfect example of where something like a green bank can step in. It can identify that faulty risk assumption and correct for it.
Is there a real-world example of this working? Because that sounds like a potential game changer.
Yeah, there's a great one. The Connecticut Green Bank's Solar for All program. They basically realized the FICO score was, irrelevant for predicting if someone would pay for solar on their roof. So they switched. They started using alternative underwriting criteria. The main question became, did the homeowner consistently pay their utility bill for the last 12 months? Simple as that.
Because paying your electricity bill is obviously a much better predictor of whether you'll pay your solar bill than some old credit card debt.
Precisely. And that simple logical change, it led to a stunning result. A 188% increase in solar adoption in low-income communities in Connecticut. It just shows that risk isn't always fixed. Sometimes it's just, baked into outdated ways of measuring things, lazy lending, maybe.
That's really powerful. And these public dollars, it's not just about fixing metrics, right? It's the leverage. The sources say green banks in the U.S., on average, pull in about $3 in private money for every $1 they invest directly.
And this bigger accelerator idea is designed to maximize that leverage even more, using things like capital recycling, so loans get repaid, projects get refinanced, assets are sold, and the money goes back in. The projections suggest that over its lifetime, the accelerator could achieve a total investment multiplier of more than 30 times its initial public funding. That's the kind of amplification you need if you're trying to move 6 times faster.
Okay, so let's say we figure out the funding with green banks and accelerators. The next giant hurdle is, how do we actually build all this stuff efficiently? That takes us to planning. And when you look globally, especially in the global south, these older planning ideas, they seem really sticky, often combined with that sort of urban modernism imported decades ago from the global north. They just haven't gone away.
And that resilience is often a real problem because these persistent planning models, they often cause or worsen serious social issues. You get segregated land uses, the poor pushed out to the edges where there's no transport. You also get huge levels of illegality, people building homes without permits because the official zoning standards, often based on Western ideas, are just impossible for most people to meet.
Right. So we need to move beyond those old siloed master plans, something more joined up. The EU seems to be really pushing this idea of coordinated energy infrastructure planning, CEI planning. What's the main driver forcing sectors like gas, electricity, transport to finally talk to each other?
It's that 2050 decarbonization target, mainly, coupled with just how long big infrastructure takes to build. These network projects, new power grids, expanding pipelines, they typically take 10 years, sometimes more, from the first idea to actually being operational.
10 years when you're trying to accelerate things sixfold. That timeline just doesn't work.
Exactly. So if you don't coordinate planning across all the sectors, electricity, gas, transport, heating and cooling, even IT and telecoms, now the infrastructure you finally build, it's likely to be late, less effective, maybe less secure, and definitely more expensive. The energy transition targets just make coordination unavoidable. Think about hydrogen, for instance. The EU targets, like 40 gigawatts of electrolyzers between 2025 and 2030. You can't possibly plan your electricity grid upgrades without knowing where all that hydrogen production is going to happen. It has to be linked.
That level of complexity, it feels like traditional planning tools, paper maps and spreadsheets just can't handle it. How do planners manage that kind of integration?
Well, to manage this, planners are increasingly turning to these really disruptive technologies, specifically urban digital twins, UDTs.
Urban digital twins. Okay, sounds a bit sci-fi, but they're actually very practical tools, right? I kind of picture it like SimCity, but, for a real city using real data streams.
That's actually a pretty good analogy. A UDT is basically a dynamic digital replica of a city. It integrates the natural environment, the built environment, and all the human activities happening within it. What this does is create a common reference model, a single virtual version of the city that everyone, politicians, engineers, planners, the public can use to collaborate based on the same information.
And the key part there must be dynamic or real-time. How does the physical city talk to its digital twin?
Yeah, that's done through a concept called the digital shadow. Essentially, it means there's an automated, often real-time flow of data from sensors out in the real world, maybe in the water system, or a building's management system flowing directly into the digital model.
Okay, so it's a living model, constantly updated, not just a static 3D blueprint.
Exactly. And that enables really powerful scenario planning. Instead of just guessing how a new flood defense might perform, you can model it. You can simulate its impact by combining historical data with live sensor feeds during a storm event, for example. It gives cities a much clearer, faster picture of how the whole system might behave under stress. It helps planning move from being reactive to being genuinely predictive. Hashtag tag outro. So wrapping things up, we've covered quite a bit. That critical investment gap facing the world, the really innovative financial engineering like green banks using alternative underwriting that's needed to fund the climate transition affordably, and finally, this huge evolution in planning. Moving away, hopefully, from old siloed master plans towards these hyper-coordinated digital systems, CEI planning, urban digital twins.
Yeah, the knowledge is there. The frameworks are getting quite mature. We're seeing successful pilots, especially from European research programs. The big challenge now, it feels like, is just the urgency, the speed. We have to get these successful ideas, whether it's a banking model or a digital twin platform, rolled out widely, nationally, globally, fast.
I think the biggest risk right now isn't that we don't know what to do. It's that we fall back into incremental steps. That risks stranding all this great research, meaning we have to redevelop things later, which costs more time and money. We need to be bold, go big, go fast.
And that urgency leaves us with maybe a final provocative thought for you. Building on what we heard about the failures of older planning, we talked about how those old models often imported, created, or worsened spatial divides, marginalized whole communities. So now, as these new, incredibly complex, tech-heavy planning tools like urban digital twins become the standard for optimizing cities, tools that depend so much on data, complex models, specialized expertise, how do we make absolutely sure they get used to genuinely tackle problems like poverty and social exclusion? How do we prevent them from just becoming sophisticated instruments for urban elites or corporations focused purely on, high-level efficiency? That tension, equity versus optimization feels like it sits right at the heart of how we build infrastructure for the next century. Something to think about.